Shabbat Shalom. For all of the iconic lines in Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, one of them this week rang especially appropriate. She broke your throne and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the Hallelujah. Although he is not named explicitly, the first verse of Leonard's beloved anthem is assumed to reference Samson the judge, the most famous Nazarite in Jewish history. His miraculous conception and birth are recorded in the Haftarah that we just heard, the prophetic reading which follows the verses from this week's Torah portion. Samson, very unusually, only Samuel is similar in our Torah, at least that we know in our Tanakh. Samson was declared a lifelong Nazarite before his birth. He had to abstain from all grape-related products, never come in contact with a human corpse, and never cut his hair. Notably, his mother was instructed to eat well and drink no alcohol during her pregnancy, an early and remarkable awareness of the connection between the health of an expectant mother and her unborn child. But after a life of legendary drama and great misadventure, it was Samson's intoxication with the treacherous Delilah that led to his downfall. When she finally, you'd think he would have learned after what happens leading up to the famous moment of his hair being cut, he doesn't learn. When she finally tricks him into disclosing the real source of his renowned Herculean strength, in Samson's case, of course, you all know his uncut hair, she actually doesn't cut his hair herself. She brings in someone else to do it, and that's maybe for another day, but it's a detail you can miss pretty easily. She brings in someone else, someone unnamed, has Samson's hair shorn while he slept, and then he was weak as a baby, cruelly blinded, and taken prisoner. With a last burst of divinely given energy as his hair starts to grow back, Samson does give a mighty hallelujah, a mighty praise to the Eternal, and topples the pillars, bringing down the walls of the great hall upon himself and upon the thousands of Philistines who were there wildly celebrating his capture. That all takes place long after today's Haftarah, but in a remarkable section of the book of Judges, chapters 13 through 16. Samson is a fascinating, wonderfully flawed biblical superhero whose identity as a Nazir was chosen for him. But the Torah portion indicates that both men and women could, for a period of time, elect to take the Nazarite vow on their own accord. For the duration of their vow, they would consume nothing derived from grapes, they would let their hair grow free, and have no contact at all with the dead, even if they were close family members. In the last prohibition, Nazarites raised themselves temporarily to the level of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, who was the only Kohen forbidden from proximity to even the corpses of their nearest kin. All other Kohanim were to refrain from being near the dead, or even to this day, some of them refrain from visiting a grave site or a cemetery. But they could, all Kohanim could, for all of their nearest kin, but not the high priest. He was in a special and highly consecrated place. Must have been really hard to be the Kohen Gadol. But priesthood could never be chosen. You didn't go apply for a temporary priesthood. It was determined only and always by birth. And this way, these Nazarite vows were a way to experience even a brief passage into the Kohanic life. And it's curious and compelling, especially with the extreme prohibition about even if a close family member passed away, you couldn't participate. Now, the vows were generally for about a month, so we weren't talking certainly a lifetime, but we might have a little bit of an insight into why Samson and even Samuel lived the kinds of lives they did. This was an extreme way of life in many ways. So I thought to myself this year, what could have motivated a person to take a Nazarite's vow? And was it a good thing or not? The fact that women could make the vow is pretty remarkable. Certainly women couldn't be priests, and yet they could participate equally in this option, which I find noteworthy. Nazaritism apparently satisfied some deep-seated need for some people in the ancient world who needed a different or deeper connection with God, and to live for a little while as a member of God's innermost circle. Some sages describe the Nazarites as akin to prophets, although we don't have any evidence of them hearing the call of God like the prophets of old. Samson was unusual. The prevailing thought is that the Nazarite vows, lasted generally about 30 days, and at first glance, they seem pretty positive. A sincere and pious offering of oneself to a time of mindful discipline and abstinence. But, surprise, surprise, the great sages are divided, sometimes even within themselves, about how to feel toward this rather opaque enterprise. We read in Numbers 6:8, throughout his term as a Nazarite, the Nazar is holy to God. Well, it seems positive enough, but at the conclusion of the exercise, if you were still focusing on the reading when it got into the sacrifice part, the soon-to-be former Nazarite would approach the temple at the end of the period and bring a year-old male lamb without defect for a burnt offering, a year-old ewe lamb without defect for a sin offering, and one ram without blemish for an offering of well-being. That was Numbers 6, verse 14. So the primary controversy in the Torah surrounds the notion of the sin offering. Why did the soon-to-be former Nazarite have to bring a sin offering? Was it required because the Nazarite was now renouncing the life of more extreme abstinence and piety, and as such was considered sinful? Or was it the exact opposite, that a sin offering was required because the uncommanded vow of more extreme abstinence and piety was made in the first place? There is not, as you might be expecting, universal agreement. Either way, whether the Nazir was about to re-enter a more regular life of sinful temptations or had erred in the first place by giving up some of the joys of life, the joy of grape wine or even grape juice for the period of their Nazariteship, not cutting their hair and just, potentially not being able to participate in the funeral of a loved one, should that, God forbid, have happened, maybe that was sinful enough. So the Nazirs stay in kind of a strange protected status, one that is mysterious to this day. It's true we might revere people who take on greater stringencies than the traditional demands of an upright and moral life. We often call those people holy. But Judaism has never preached asceticism and self-denial as the ideal way of life. We are supposed to be in the world, not separate from it, practicing moderation, striving to live joyously, richly, and in balance, not hedonistically, wastefully, or in extremes. And that is a hefty task indeed. For those who struggle with destructive aspects of our Yetzer Hara, our potentially harmful urges, a time-bound period of abstinence and retreat from the world and its temptations can be a powerful tonic. I know that there are those among us who yearn or have maybe even been able to experience a time of retreat from the world, maybe a silent retreat or a cleansing retreat or just some time in the mountains to live cleanly, healthfully, and a little bit off the grid. It's an individual journey, and it likely spoke to a very personal and private need. And yet we can't observe it since the fall of the temple, almost 2,000 years ago. But it still may have deep resonance in our time. I was thinking of times when communally we abstain from things. Some people during the period of the Omer, where some people don't cut their hair in that time of semi-mourning, just finished the other day. Communities where Lent is observed and people choose something from which to abstain in the days leading up to Easter. And I was thinking also of Ramadan and the collective fasts that observant Muslim families take on. Sure, they're difficult, but I know that that sense of communal abstention can create a sense of togetherness and a shared experience. But these Nazarites didn't do so as a group. This was a personal journey, and I wonder if maybe each of us has something that we might want to abstain from a little while, if it made us feel that we could be on a higher elevated plane. Rabbi Lisa Grushchow writes movingly about a woman who was inspired by the Nazarites, and she wrote a vow of permanent abstinence from alcohol as a central part of her journey to sobriety. She added an additional promise not to cut her hair for a year. That's required, then I've been a Nazarite for almost 2 years, can't get around to it, but not. She added an additional promise not to cut her hair for a year as a way to increase humility during part of her recovery journey. And by claiming her place in the history of Nazarites, she affirmed that she was doing so to be closer to the holy presence and to be the best version of herself that she could be. The Nazarite section in the Torah concludes, as you noticed, with the priestly benediction. And I think that it's not there by accident. The priestly benediction was to be given by the Kohanim. And yet, the priestly benediction has become available to anyone in the Jewish world, and sometimes even out of the Jewish world, who would like to offer a blessing to someone else. I think that the juxtaposition of the Nazarite experience with the priestly benediction has something to do with the Torah knowing that those of us who are not Kohanim and descendants from the Kohanim, present company excluded, might like occasionally to try on what that feels like. And so whether you are being a Nazarite for a few weeks or incorporating the words of the priestly benediction to give to children, if that is your choice and your circumstance, or maybe to a friend or a loved one in need, to offer that blessing, to give the priestly benediction, even if we're not priests, is a powerful way to fulfill the promise back in Exodus chapter 19:6, when we were invited to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It's a wonderful notion. Maybe try it on for a moment. Who would you bless if you could be a priest for a moment? And you're invited to do that every week. Could you see yourself stepping out of the mundane to become a priestly, holier vessel? We don't need to be Samsons or superheroes to live mighty lives, but maybe with some small, careful, deliberate changes and additions of liturgy and additions of prayers being given to other people, and maybe if we're lucky, they might give us a blessing. Maybe we can yet build monuments to greatness and deeper pathways to inner peace. Shabbat Shalom.